The classroom echoed with laughter. Loud, cruel, sharp. Mr. Anderson, the infamous math teacher known more for his arrogance than his equations, stood at the front of the room with a smirk curling across his lips. With theatrical flair, he held out a piece of white chalk, not to a student, but to Mary Jackson, the school janitor. She stood by the corner, broom in hand, frozen. Her uniform was faded, her hands calloused, her back slightly hunched from years of silent labor. Her gray curls peeked from under a simple scarf, and her eyes, those deep, tired eyes, were focused on the ground. "Well, Mary," Anderson said loudly, waving the chalk in front of her, "since you seem to be so interested in my lesson today, why not give this problem a try?" The class burst out again, some students nearly falling out of their seats from laughter. A few sneered, whispering jokes about janitors doing math, their voices just loud enough for her to hear. Mary didn't speak. She'd been invisible in this building for over 20 years. The walls of Jefferson High had watched her sweep its floors, empty its trash, scrub its toilets, all without recognition. To these students, she was just a quiet old woman pushing a cart. To Mr. Anderson, she was just a tool for his next humiliating punchline. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Mary Jackson had once stood in front of a chalkboard just like this. Not with a broom, but with a dream. She looked at the chalk in his hand, then at the problem on the board, and something shifted in her eyes. She stepped forward, not to clean, but to answer. Jefferson High School was polished. Perfectly mowed lawns. Glass trophy cases lined with decades of academic and athletic victories. The students walked the halls in designer sneakers, their futures seemingly guaranteed by privilege and polished last names. It was an elite institution, prestigious, wealthy, overwhelmingly white. But behind its ivy-covered walls and diversity brochures, something colder lived. Something deeper than what met the eye. Prejudice, quiet, subtle, but ever-present, moved through the hallways like a draft, chilling those who did not belong. Mary Jackson felt it every day. She arrived at dawn, long before the students. Pushed her cart quietly past classroom doors, emptied trash bins before the first bell, and scrubbed floors long after the last locker slammed shut. No one noticed her. Or rather, they chose not to. Teachers barely acknowledged her with a nod. Students passed her like she was part of the wallpaper. Some whispered behind her back, others did not bother whispering at all. A few even laughed when she bent down to pick up their crumpled snack wrappers from the floor. The look in their eyes said it clearly. She's just the janitor. Mary never responded, never snapped back. She had long learned that silence was safer. Confrontation was a luxury she could not afford. Still, it hurt. Every ignored greeting, every sidelong glance, every door that slammed in her face without apology, it carved a little deeper into her. Over time, she began to shrink inside herself. She moved more quietly, spoke less, smiled only when absolutely necessary. She was no longer a person to them, just a shadow that swept, a silence that wiped, a ghost in Jefferson's polished halls. But on that day, when Mr. Anderson handed her that chalk, something stirred beneath the layers of pain and dust, something long buried, and it was ready to rise. As Mary stood in the back of that bright, cold classroom, the chalk still in her hand from Mr. Anderson's cruel gesture, her mind drifted, not into fear, but memory. She had not always been invisible. Decades ago, Mary Jackson had walked different halls. The buildings were older, the walls lined with ivy, and the air thick with the hum of ambition. Columbia University, one of the finest in the country. She had earned her place there, not through wealth or family legacy, but through grit, brilliance, and an unstoppable love for mathematics. Mary was one of the only black women in the mathematics department. Her professors, impressed by her raw intellect, often challenged her with complex theorems others avoided. She solved them with quiet confidence. In classrooms dominated by white students, she often had the highest test scores. Her mind saw numbers like poetry, beautiful, fluid, precise. But the higher she climbed, the more brutal the descent became. Whispers behind her back turned into notes left on her desk. "You do not belong here." Quota filler. Sometimes her textbooks disappeared. Her questions were met with cold silences. Group projects excluded her entirely. Still, she endured. For her family. For herself. Until one night, the phone rang. Her father, her rock, her pride, had fallen from a scaffold at the construction site where he worked. Spinal injury. No insurance. No savings. Mary packed her bags the next day. No graduation. No farewell. She left Columbia not because she had failed, but because life, cruel and indifferent, had forced her to choose between a future and her family's survival. As she rode the train home, her hands clutched her textbook so tightly the corners bent. She whispered a promise to herself between silent sobs. One day, I will come back. That day never came. Life happened instead. Bills, jobs, children, cleaning floors, folding bedsheets. But the equations never left her. They echoed in her dreams, lingered in the chalk dust she swept every morning. And now, here in this classroom, the very same chalk resting in her palm. Maybe life was giving her that second chance. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to take it. The moment Mr. Anderson saw Mary quietly sweeping near the door, his lips curled into a smug smile. There she was, the old janitor, hunched slightly from years of labor, broom in hand, eyes low as always. To him, she was not a person. She was part of the background, a fixture, someone to step around, not speak to. But today, he was feeling arrogant. The lesson had gone well. His ego was fed. And now, he saw a chance for amusement. Mary, he said suddenly, loud enough to cut through the classroom chatter. She froze. The broom halted mid-sweep. The students turned. First in confusion, then in anticipation. Anderson's tone dripped with sarcasm. You've been hanging around these walls for years. I bet you have picked up a thing or two from my lessons. A few students chuckled. Mary didn't move. He pointed to the chalkboard behind him, where a monstrous calculus equation stretched edge to edge. Come on up. Show us what you've learned. The classroom erupted in laughter. You serious? One student blurted. She probably thinks calculus is cleaning supplies, someone else whispered just loud enough. She can't even read it, another muttered, snickering. Anderson leaned against his desk, crossing his arms, enjoying the show. Don't be shy, Mary. We could all use a surprise today. Mary's hands tightened on the broom handle. Her eyes, calm but heavy, scanned the room. The laughter echoed, not just through the walls, but through the years of silent humiliation she had quietly endured. No one expected her to do anything but retreat. Maybe wipe away a tear, whisper an apology, and disappear back into the hallway like always. But Mary did not move back. She took one quiet breath and walked toward the board, not to be mocked, but to rewrite the story. Mary stood still, the laughter still buzzing around her like flies. Her heart pounded, not fast, but heavy, like every beat carried the weight of every insult she had swallowed over the years. Her calloused fingers trembled slightly, still gripping the broom. Her eyes dropped to the polished floor, then slowly lifted to the chalk resting in the tray. She did not want to walk. She wanted to vanish. But something inside her shifted. Not rage. Not pride. Something deeper. A memory. 30 years ago, a younger Mary sat in a cold lecture hall at Columbia University. Her fingers gripped a pencil tightly, her mind dancing through equations that others struggled to follow. Her professor had called her the sharpest mind in the room. But the eyes around her had not mirrored admiration. They stared with disdain. Because she was the only black woman in the room, and because she was brilliant. She remembered the cruel notes slipped into her textbooks. The sabotage during group projects. The whispered warnings, you don't belong here. She remembered how it all crumbled the day her father fell from a scaffold and her family could no longer survive without her paycheck. She dropped out, packed her dreams in silence, and went home. She never touched a math problem again. Until now. Now, those memories were not pain. They were fuel. Mary inhaled deeply. And then, she walked. One slow step after another. Each step was heavy, not because of fear, but because it carried a history no one else in that room could begin to understand. The laughter quieted. Even Anderson leaned back, surprised. The janitor, this old black woman, was actually going to try? Mary reached the board. Her hand hovered over the chalk. She picked it up. Her fingers did not shake. The moment Mary's fingers closed around the piece of chalk, the room fell into a strange, electric silence. The kind of silence that comes before something historic happens. She stood before the blackboard, the complex equation looming above her head like a mountain built to break spirits. A swirl of Greek letters, limits, and integrals covered the board, an unsolved challenge meant to intimidate. She did not hesitate. The chalk touched the board with a soft, deliberate click. Her first stroke was steady, not rushed, not cautious. It moved with rhythm, like someone who was not just remembering math, but speaking its language. A simple substitution, a reduction of variables, a conversion from symbols into structure. The students who had been chuckling seconds ago sat frozen, watching. Someone in the second row leaned forward slightly. Another closed their mouth mid-smirk. Mary's hand moved smoothly across the board. Each line she wrote building on the last with quiet authority. Not showy, not dramatic, just precise, efficient, beautiful. Anderson's grin, so wide just a moment ago, wavered. He shifted in place, his arms uncrossing. A wrinkle appeared between his brows. Mary continued. She paused once, tapped the chalk thoughtfully against the tray, then began a sequence of transformations that simplified the expression down with stunning elegance. It was as if the board had opened a door to a version of her that had been locked away for decades, when the world had forgotten, but she never had. Her back was straight. Her face was calm. And with every passing second, every clean symbol she etched into the board, the illusion that she was just a janitor began to collapse. No one laughed now. No one spoke. Only the sound of chalk moving across the blackboard remained. As Mary continued writing on the board, her mind drifted, not with hesitation, but with purpose, into the shadows of her past. She remembered Columbia, the proud gates, the polished hallways, the way her heart once raced not with fear, but ambition. Back then, she had been one of the few black women in the mathematics department, a prodigy by every definition. Numbers had come naturally to her, and professors once whispered about her brilliance in hushed admiration. But not everyone whispered in praise. There were messages scrawled on her dorm door in red marker. Go back to where you came from. You don't belong here. They were not just written in ink. They were carved into her memory. She remembered walking into classrooms and being the only black student, sitting alone in the back, raising her hand, only to be ignored, being left out of study groups, not for lack of intelligence, but because of the color of her skin. She endured it all because her dream mattered, until one phone call changed everything. Her father, her strongest supporter, had been gravely injured at the factory. A fall, a broken spine, the kind of injury that turned dreams into debts overnight. She left Columbia the following week. No fanfare, no goodbyes, just a quiet withdrawal form in a single suitcase. Mary had planned to return someday, but someday never came. Years passed in silence. She took cleaning jobs. She tucked her notebooks away. She became invisible because invisibility was safe. She learned to fold her brilliance into herself, to bow her head when spoken down to smile gently when ignored. Until now. Now, standing in front of the blackboard, with the entire class watching, she was not just solving an equation. She was unburying the version of herself that Columbia tried to erase. Every number she wrote was not just math, it was survival. It was defiance. It was justice. And for the first time in 3 decades, she was not hiding. She was reclaiming. Mary's hand moved steadily, the chalk whispering against the blackboard in sharp, fluid strokes. The silence in the room was thick. No laughter now, no muttered comments. Only the quiet rhythm of logic unfolding in front of their eyes. She began at the top, neatly rewriting the complex equation that had mocked so many students for weeks. Then, with precision born of both talent and years of hidden practice, she moved to the first step, isolating variables, simplifying terms. The air was tense, but her mind was calm. It all returned to her effortlessly, as if the numbers had been waiting patiently for this day. Lines formed, each one clear and methodical. Symbols, fractions, and substitutions followed in perfect order. She never paused, never hesitated. Her grip on the chalk was firm, her breathing even. The board slowly filled with the kind of elegant logic only someone who truly understood the language of mathematics could produce. A few students leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide. Whispers turned to stunned silence. The same mouths that had laughed minutes ago now hung open in disbelief. Even the brightest student in class, Jeremy, furrowed his brow, not because he was confused, but because he recognized the brilliance in what he was seeing. He had tried this problem. He had failed. But Mary was solving it like she had written the question herself. At the back of the room, Mr. Anderson's arms slowly uncrossed. His smug posture loosened. The smirk on his face dissolved as beads of doubt crept into his expression. He watched, unable to interrupt, as the janitor he had mocked dismantled his ego line by line. Mary reached the final step. She paused for a heartbeat. Then, with one firm motion, she wrote the solution, boxed it cleanly, and underlined it with a steady hand. Then she set the chalk down. The class was frozen. Not a breath was heard. Mary turned and faced them, eyes filled with quiet fire. Not triumph, not arrogance, just dignity. A dignity that had waited 30 years for this moment. Mr. Anderson stared at the board, his lips parted slightly. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Mary turned slowly, her back now to the blackboard that carried every truth she had buried for decades. The room remained still, as if even the air itself dared not move. She picked up the eraser but did not use it. Instead, she faced them all, her chin raised, her gaze steady. "This is the answer," she said, her voice neither loud nor trembling, but firm, clear like the final stroke of a gavel. Her eyes met Mr. Anderson's first. His jaw was tight, his arms still folded, but the color had drained from his face. He looked like a man staring at a mirror he no longer recognized. Mary stepped away from the board and placed the chalk gently on the tray. Then, after a pause, she spoke again, this time to the entire class. "You may not know me. You may only see the mop, the keys, the uniform. But what you see is not all that I am." A few students looked down in shame. Others stared, wide-eyed, as if meeting her for the first time. Do not ever mistake silence for ignorance, or age for incompetence, or skin for limitation. The words hit the room like a thunderclap, measured, deliberate, undeniable. I stood back for years. Not because I lacked the mind, but because life required I use my strength elsewhere. She took a single step closer to the students. "But today, just for today, I needed you to see that your assumptions are your weakness, not mine." Not a single student moved. Not one dared to interrupt. And in that moment, Mary Jackson, the janitor they had never really seen, was no longer just someone who cleaned their classrooms. She was the most powerful voice in the room. For a long breath, the room remained frozen. No movement, no sound, just the echo of Mary's voice hanging heavy in the air. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, a student whispered, barely loud enough to be heard, "She really did it." Heads slowly turned. Students who had once snickered were now sitting stiff in their seats, faces flushed, their eyes darting between Mary and the perfect solution still glowing on the blackboard. Another student muttered under his breath, "That was genius." The energy in the room had shifted, no longer thick with ridicule, but filled with something else entirely. Shame, reflection, awakening. A girl in the back row looked down at her notebook, biting her lip as if replaying every time she had walked past Mary without ever once meeting her eyes. Mr. Anderson stood motionless, arms at his sides now. His smugness had collapsed completely, replaced with a stunned vacancy. Then it happened. A slow clap. Just one. A young boy near the window, hands coming together once, then again, unsure at first. Then another joined. And then another. Soon, the entire classroom was clapping soft at first, then rising in strength like a tide coming in. But this was not the applause of performance. It was not loud or boastful. It was the sound of respect, of realization, of something being made right. Mary did not smile. She did not bow. She simply stood there, composed and silent, accepting the moment not as praise, but as recognition of something long overdue. And as the clapping swelled, the students knew, perhaps for the first time, that they were not just witnessing a math solution. They were witnessing a reckoning. Mr. Anderson did not move. He stood by the edge of his desk, the same place he had delivered so many lectures, commands, and smug dismissals. But now, his arms were no longer crossed, his posture no longer upright. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. The blackboard behind Mary was no longer just a board. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, Anderson saw something he had never seen before, his own prejudice, reflected back at him with mathematical precision. His eyes darted over the flawless equations. No errors, no missteps, just truth. Truth that humiliated him more than any argument ever could. He blinked, as if hoping the problem had somehow rewritten itself, that she had made a mistake, that he could still regain control. But the only thing that changed was him. A strange pressure filled his chest, a slow, heavy ache of shame he was not used to carrying. He had always been the smartest man in the room, the one who mocked others from behind his authority. But now, in front of 30 silent students and a humble janitor, he realized he had become the fool. The teacher had just been taught. He reached for the edge of the desk to steady himself, his fingers trembling. His face, usually so sure and polished, was now pale. His jaw clenched, but there was no strength behind it. just the weight of everything he had ignored for years. And for the first time in his entire teaching career, Mark Anderson, the man who had never lost an argument, felt something unfamiliar clawing at him from the inside. Powerlessness. Because the truth did not care about his degrees, his status, or his skin. Today, it had stood at the blackboard and written itself in Mary's hand. Principal Robert Williams sat in his office when a knock came at the door. A senior teacher rushed in, eyes wide. "You need to come to Mr. Anderson's class. Something just happened. Something big." Minutes later, Williams stood outside room 203, hearing whispers ripple through the hall like electricity. Inside, the students were buzzing, not with gossip, but with awe. And there, on the blackboard, was a solution so precise, so advanced, it looked like it belonged in a university lecture hall. And standing near the desk, quiet and still, was Mary Jackson. Later that afternoon, Principal Williams walked down the long corridor to the janitor's supply closet. He paused at the door and knocked gently. Mary opened it, still in her work clothes, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face was calm. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, voice softer than usual. "May I have a moment?" She nodded and stepped aside. The small room was crowded with mops, buckets, and the scent of disinfectant. Williams looked around, then turned to her. "I saw what you did. I heard what happened. And I am not here to offer praise. I am here with a proposition. Would you consider teaching part-time with our math department? We need minds like yours. Hearts like yours." Mary smiled, gracefully, but with that same quiet fire. "I appreciate the offer, sir," she said. "Truly. But I do not need a title to prove my worth." She looked him in the eye. "My purpose was never to be seen for what I do, but for who I am. If today taught anyone that, then I have already done what I came here to do." Williams nodded slowly, deeply moved. And in that small, dim room, respect was exchanged, not in words, but in truth. By the next morning, Jefferson High School did not feel like the same place. Mary walked through the front doors just as she had every day for the last 20 years, quietly, mop bucket in hand, her modest uniform neatly pressed. But this time, students turned their heads not with mockery or indifference, but with respect. A boy from Mr. Anderson's class stepped aside, held the door open, and nodded. "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson." She nodded back, a soft smile on her lips. In the teacher's lounge, the shift was just as noticeable. Colleagues who had once looked right through her now looked inward, at themselves. Some could hardly meet her gaze, their faces heavy with realization. Others whispered about what had happened, not out of gossip, but out of stunned reverence. Mrs. Hill, the history teacher, later stood up during a faculty meeting and said what everyone was already thinking. "We have spent years claiming this school stands for excellence, and yet we failed to recognize the excellence that has quietly walked among us every day." Mary Jackson taught a lesson none of us were prepared for, but one we all needed. Students began asking questions, not just about math, but about fairness, dignity, and how easily assumptions become prejudice. In English class, the story of Mary's moment at the blackboard became a prompt for discussion. In social studies, Mr. Reynolds used it to start a unit on systemic bias. Even the school counselor began holding open forums called Respect Talks, where students could speak honestly about the silent biases they had carried and those they had inflicted. And through it all, Mary stayed the same. She still swept the halls, polished the windows, and emptied the trash. But now, every footstep she took echoed with the quiet power of a lesson learned school-wide. Respect is not given by status. It is earned by character. And Mary Jackson had earned it, without saying a word. It was late afternoon when Mr. Anderson finally gathered the courage to face her. The hallways had emptied, shadows stretching across the linoleum floors as sunlight poured through the tall windows. Mary was alone in the janitor's closet, carefully sorting her cleaning supplies like she had done every day, long before any student or teacher had noticed her presence. Anderson stood outside the door for a long moment, his hand hesitating in the air before he gently knocked. The door creaked open. Mary looked up, her expression calm, almost unreadable. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Not clipped or commanding, just human. She paused, resting her rag on the counter. "Mr. Anderson." He stepped inside, the silence between them weighing heavier than any chalkboard lesson. I came to say something I should have said a long time ago, he began. I was wrong. Deeply wrong. Mary said nothing, only looked at him with the patience of someone who had waited years for this moment, not even knowing it would come. Anderson's voice wavered. I let arrogance blind me. I mocked you to entertain my students. I assumed things about you based on nothing but my own prejudice. I am sorry. Mary looked at him for a long, measured beat. Then she said, simply, thank you for saying that. Anderson nodded, ashamed. I know it is not enough. It is a start, she replied gently. But words fade. What matters is what you do from here. He swallowed hard, eyes brimming with regret. Do better, Mr. Anderson. For their sake, she said, nodding toward the empty hallway. And with those 3 words, she offered him something greater than forgiveness, a chance to change. The Jefferson High auditorium buzzed with anticipation. For the first time in the school's history, the room was filled not for a sports rally or a visiting politician, but for a janitor. Mary Jackson walked slowly onto the stage, her shoes quiet against the polished wood. She wore her usual navy cardigan and slacks, nothing flashy. But her presence held more power than any spotlight. The crowd, a mix of students, teachers, and parents, fell silent. Principal Williams stepped forward to introduce her. Today, we honor not just a member of our staff, but a woman of strength, brilliance, and dignity, Mrs. Mary Jackson. A ripple of applause broke the silence, warm but unsure. Mary approached the podium, placed her notes gently, then looked out at the faces before her. I was never supposed to be here, she began, her voice steady. Not on this stage. Not in front of you. For most of my life, I was taught to stay in the background, to work hard, to not speak unless spoken to. A hush fell again, deeper than before. I had dreams, she continued. Once, I studied mathematics at Columbia University. I solved problems that baffled others. But when my father was injured, when money ran out, when prejudice knocked louder than opportunity, I stepped away. She paused, allowing the words to settle. I became a janitor, not because I lacked skill, but because I had to survive. And for 30 years, I lived in silence, until one of you asked me to solve a math problem, thinking it would humiliate me. I turned toward the front row where Mr. Anderson sat, his head bowed. I solved it, Mary said, softly. But what I truly solved was the illusion. The lie that worth is defined by appearance, by job title, by color. Students leaned forward. Teachers sat straighter. Something in the room had shifted. We talk about intelligence like it belongs to the few, but it lives in many. All it needs is the chance to be seen. She stepped back from the microphone, and for a moment, silence lingered. Then the auditorium erupted. Applause. Whistles. Even tears. For the first time, Mary Jackson was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable. The next morning, Mary Jackson arrived at Jefferson High School just as she always had, before the sun was fully up, keys in hand, mop bucket rolling softly beside her. Nothing had changed in her routine. She still walked the long hallways in silence. Still wiped down windows and polished lockers. Still replaced the paper towels in the faculty restrooms. But as she moved through the corridors, something was different. The silence that used to greet her had turned into respectful murmurs. Students who once passed her with blank stares now lowered their heads politely. A soft, "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson," met her ears again and again. Some smiled. Some even looked ashamed. Teachers who once overlooked her now made way in the halls. They greeted her not as staff, but as a colleague, as an equal. She had not changed, but everything around her had. In the teacher's lounge, her name was now spoken with respect. In classrooms, students debated not just math problems, but the meaning of dignity, worth, and hidden potential. Her story had become a quiet catalyst. By that afternoon, local news had picked it up. Janitor shocks elite school with mathematical genius. Reporters called. A news truck waited outside. But Mary stayed inside. She had said what needed to be said. She did not need more microphones. In the community, parents began talking to their children about respect, about how they viewed others who looked or lived differently. The janitor who had once been invisible was now a symbol, not of pity, but of power earned through quiet strength. Mary's face would never appear on magazine covers. She would never tweet a viral quote. But her story had taken root. In that school, in those hearts, and that was enough. As she paused near the math classroom door, she saw Mr. Anderson inside, silently preparing his lesson. He looked up. Their eyes met. He nodded. She nodded back. Mary turned, mop in hand, and walked on. Her shoes squeaked gently across the floor, but the silence behind her was no longer cold. It was full of something new. Respect. Mary Jackson did not seek to be seen. But now, she would never be forgotten.